Let's begin. The front door clicked shut behind me as I stepped into our home, the familiar scent of Suzanne's perfume lingering in the air. I loosened my tie, feeling the weight of another long day at the office slowly lift from my shoulders. Suzanne? I called out, my voice echoing through the quiet house. No response. Typical these days, I thought, pushing away the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right between us. Marriage had its ups and downs. After all, this was just a rough patch. I made my way to the kitchen, grabbing a cold beer from the fridge. As I popped the cap off, a sharp knock at the door cut through the silence. Frowning, I set the bottle down and headed to answer it. The moment I swung the door open, the stench of alcohol hit me like a wave. Brian Miller, my neighbor from 2 houses down, stood there swaying slightly, a smug grin plastered across his face. Well, if it isn't Raphael Howard, he slurred, pushing past me into the foyer. The man of the hour. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to shove him back out onto the porch. Brian, you're drunk. Go home. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that set my teeth on edge. Oh, I will. But first, I've got a little present for you. He reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and lacy. Recognize these? My stomach dropped as he dangled a pair of panties in front of my face. Suzanne's panties. Your wife. Brian continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. She's a wildcat in bed. We've done it over 40 times. He tossed the underwear at me, laughing as they hit my chest and fell to the floor. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Brian's words sank in. Suzanne, my wife. 40 times. You're lying, I managed to choke out, even as a part of me knew it was true. The late nights at work, the emotional distance, the way she'd pull away from my touch, it all suddenly made horrifying sense. Brian opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of footsteps on the stairs caught our attention. We both turned to see Suzanne descending, her face a mask of cold indifference. John, she said, using my middle name in a tone that sent chills down my spine. It's official. I'm leaving you. My lawyer will contact you soon. I stared at her, searching for any sign of the woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved for years. But there was nothing, just icy detachment as she confirmed my worst fears. So it's true then, I said, my voice unnaturally calm. You and him. Suzanne didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Yes, it's been going on for months. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but don't, I cut her off, holding up a hand. Don't pretend you care how I found out. I turned to Brian, who was watching our exchange with undisguised glee. And you'll both regret this. Forever. Brian laughed, clearly not taking my words seriously. But something in Suzanne's eyes flickered a brief moment of uncertainty before her mask of indifference slipped back into place. Come on, Brian, she said, moving towards the door. We're leaving. As they walked out, I stood there, frozen in place. The sound of the door closing behind them echoed through the empty house, a finality to it that seemed to mark the end of everything I'd known. Slowly, I made my way to the living room and sank onto the couch. The house fell into darkness around me as night crept in, but I didn't move to turn on any lights. I sat there, letting the pain and humiliation wash over me in waves. But as the hours ticked by, something else began to take root. A cold, hard determination. They thought they could walk away from this unscathed? They had no idea what was coming. In the quiet darkness of our once shared home, I began to plan. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The pain was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was overshadowed by a singular purpose: revenge. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Jerry Nolan, my best friend since college. If anyone would understand what I was going through, it was him. The phone rang twice before Jerry's gruff voice came through. Raphael? It's early, man. Everything okay? No, I said simply. Suzanne's been cheating on me. With Brian Miller. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Jesus, Raph. I'm so sorry. Do you want me to come over? Actually, I was hoping we could meet for coffee. I need your advice. An hour later, I was sitting across from Jerry in a small cafe, recounting the events of the previous night. His face darkened as I spoke, his hands clenching into fists on the table. Those bastards, he muttered when I finished. Raph, I know you're hurting, but you need to focus on moving on. Don't let them drag you down. I shook my head, leaning in closer. I'm not letting them walk away from this, Jerry. They humiliated me. They destroyed everything we built together. I want them to pay. Jerry's eyes widened slightly. Raph, think about what you're saying. Revenge isn't going to make you feel better in the long run. Maybe not, I conceded. But it'll make them feel a hell of a lot worse. He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. I can see you've made up your mind. Just be careful, okay? Don't do anything stupid. I nodded, grateful for his concern, but already planning my next move. Thanks, Jerry. I appreciate your support. As I left the cafe, I pulled out my phone again, this time dialing a different number. Malcolm Barnard, a private investigator I'd worked with on a case a few years back. Malcolm? It's Raphael Howard. I need your services. How soon can you meet? That afternoon, I sat in Malcolm's cluttered office, laying out what I needed from him. I want everything you can find on Brian Miller and Suzanne Howard, I told him. Their routines, their weaknesses, any skeletons in their closets. Leave no stone unturned. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. This sounds personal, Raphael. You sure you want to go down this road? I met his gaze steadily. I'm sure. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. I want them to regret ever crossing me. He nodded slowly, reaching for a notepad. All right then, let's get started. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into my plan. By day, I went to work as usual, playing the part of the wronged but dignified husband. But every night, I pored over the information Malcolm brought me, piecing together a strategy that would tear Brian and Suzanne's lives apart. I learned about Brian's inflated ego, his carelessness at work, his tendency to drink heavily. I discovered the cracks in their relationship, the insecurities they both tried to hide. And then, I struck. It started small. A few well-placed comments to Brian's colleagues, hinting at his unprofessional behavior. Anonymous messages to Suzanne, suggesting Brian's infidelity. Slowly but surely, I began to sow the seeds of doubt and discord. One evening, as I sat at my computer, carefully crafting another series of messages, my phone buzzed with a text from Jerry. How are you holding up? It read. I paused, considering my response. How was I? The pain was still there, but it had crystallized into something harder, colder, something that drove me forward with relentless determination. I'm fine, I typed back. Just taking care of some things. As I hit send, I couldn't help but smile. They had no idea what was coming. But soon, very soon, they would learn that betraying Raphael Howard was the biggest mistake of their lives. Weeks of meticulous planning had led to this moment. I stood in the shadows across the street from the Horizon Court building, watching as Brian strode confidently towards the entrance. He was dressed in his best suit, ready for the company's annual gala. Little did he know, this night would mark the beginning of his downfall. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Malcolm. All set? Good luck. I allowed myself a small smile as I watched Brian disappear into the building. Then, I made my way to a nearby cafe, ordered a coffee, and settled in to wait. It didn't take long. Within an hour, my phone lit up with notifications. Social media was exploding with the scandal unfolding at the Horizon Corp Gala. I scrolled through the posts, each one a testament to my careful planning. Photos of Brian in compromising positions with various women, carefully doctored by a skilled hacker Malcolm had put me in touch with. Screenshots of lewd messages he'd supposedly sent to colleagues again, fabricated but utterly convincing. And sprinkled throughout, real photos and messages from his affair with Suzanne, adding a layer of authenticity to the whole package. I could picture the scene inside. Brian's face turning pale as whispers spread through the crowd. His boss's disapproving glare. The shocked and disgusted looks from his colleagues. His carefully cultivated image crumbling before his eyes. As I sipped my coffee, a new wave of posts appeared. Videos of Brian being escorted out of the building, his face a mask of confusion and anger. I zoomed in on one, savoring the sight of his public humiliation. My phone rang. Suzanne's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, imagining her panicked voice as she tried to reach Brian. Let her worry, I thought. Her turn would come soon enough. The next morning, I made my way to the bank, a spring in my step. As I approached the teller, I put on my best concerned expression. Good morning, I said. I need to make some changes to my accounts. The teller smiled politely. Of course, Mr. Howard. What can I help you with? I need to freeze all activity on my joint account with my wife, I explained, letting a hint of worry creep into my voice. And I'd like to transfer the majority of the funds to a new, separate account under my name only. The teller's smile faltered slightly. I see. May I ask why? I leaned in, lowering my voice conspiratorially. My wife and I are having some issues. I'm afraid she might try to clean out our accounts. I just want to protect our assets until we can sort things out legally. It took some time and a few calls to managers, but eventually, it was done. I walked out of the bank knowing that when Suzanne tried to access our shared savings, she'd be in for a nasty surprise. I didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, my phone exploded with calls and texts from Suzanne. I let them all go to voicemail, each increasingly frantic message music to my ears. Finally, as evening fell, I decided to face her. I made my way home, steeling myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. The moment I walked through the door, Suzanne was on me, her face contorted with rage. What the hell did you do? She screamed. I tried to withdraw money today, and they told me the account was frozen. Where's our money, Raphael? I met her gaze coolly. Our money? I wasn't aware we still shared anything, Suzanne. Wasn't it you who said you were leaving me? She faltered for a moment, then rallied. You can't do this. I have rights. I'll sue you for every penny. By all means, I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm sure the courts will be very sympathetic to the adulterous wife who humiliated her husband. You wanted freedom, Suzanne. You got it. I watched as the reality of her situation sank in. Without access to our shared savings, she was suddenly very vulnerable. I could see the fear creeping into her eyes, replacing the anger. Raphael, please, she said, her voice softening. We can work this out. We can. No, I cut her off. We can't. You made your choice, Suzanne. Now you get to live with it. I brushed past her, heading for the stairs. As I reached the landing, I turned back to look at her. She stood in the foyer, looking small and lost. Oh, and Suzanne? I called down. You might want to check on your boyfriend. I hear he's having a rough day. With that, I retreated to my study, locking the door behind me. As I settled into my chair, I could hear Suzanne's muffled sobs from downstairs. Once, the sound would have broken my heart. Now, it only fueled my determination. This was just the beginning. By the time I was done, Brian and Suzanne would wish they'd never even met. Later that night, I found myself at O'Malley's, the dingy bar where I knew Brian liked to drink. Sure enough, there he was, slumped over the bar, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. I slid onto the stool next to him, signaling the bartender for a drink of my own. Brian's bloodshot eyes struggled to focus on me. When recognition finally dawned, his face twisted into a snarl. You, he slurred. You did this, didn't you? Somehow you set me up. I took a sip of my drink, savoring the burn. I have no idea what you're talking about, Brian. I heard you had some trouble at work. That's a shame. He lunged at me, but in his drunken state, he only succeeded in nearly falling off his stool. I steadied him with a hand on his shoulder, leaning in close. You're in over your head, I said softly. By the time this is over, you'll wish you never laid eyes on her. Brian's eyes widened, a flicker of fear breaking through his drunken haze. I gave his shoulder a squeeze, then stood up. Enjoy your drink, Brian, I said. You might not be able to afford many more of them soon. As I walked out of the bar, I could feel Brian's eyes boring into my back, but I didn't look back. I had made my point. The satisfaction of my initial strike against Brian and Suzanne was short-lived. As I sat in my study, reviewing the latest reports from Malcolm, I knew it was time to tighten the screws. Brian's public humiliation and job suspension were just the beginning. Now, it was time to ensure his complete professional ruin. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd come to know well over the past few weeks. Clark? It's Raphael. We need to talk about Brian. Clark Knapp, a coworker of Brian's I'd carefully cultivated as an ally, answered immediately. Raphael, hey, what's on your mind? I think it's time we escalate things at the office. How do you feel about spreading some rumors? There was a pause on the other end of the line. What kind of rumors are we talking about? I leaned back in my chair, a cold smile playing on my lips. The kind that could lead to a sexual harassment case. Nothing concrete, mind you, just whispers. Enough to make HR take notice. Jesus, Raphael, that's pretty serious. Absolutely, I replied. Brian didn't hesitate to destroy my life. Why should I show him any mercy? Clark sighed. All right, I'm in. But if this blows back on me, it won't, I assured him. I'll make sure you're protected. Just do your part, and Brian will be out on his ass before he knows what hit him. After hanging up, I turned my attention to Suzanne. Without access to our shared accounts, I knew she'd be struggling. It was time to twist the knife a little further. I pulled up my email and composed a message to our circle of friends, carefully worded to seem concerned rather than vindictive. Dear friends, I hope this email finds you well. I wanted to reach out and address the elephant in the room, my separation from Suzanne. I know many of you have probably heard rumors, and I wanted to set the record straight. Suzanne has chosen to leave our marriage for another man. While I'm deeply hurt by her actions, I'm more concerned about her well-being. She's made some questionable financial decisions lately, and I fear she may try to borrow money from friends to maintain her lifestyle. I'm telling you this not out of spite, but out of genuine concern. If Suzanne approaches you for financial help, please think carefully before agreeing. I would hate to see any of you taken advantage of during this difficult time. Thank you for your understanding and support. Raphael? I hit send, knowing that this would effectively cut off any financial lifeline Suzanne might have been counting on. Let her feel the full weight of her decisions. As the days passed, I watched from afar as my plans unfolded. Brian, already on thin ice at work, now found himself facing whispers and sidelong glances wherever he went. The rumors of sexual harassment spread like wildfire, and I knew it was only a matter of time before HR got involved. Suzanne, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain her facade of normalcy. I received a call from our mutual friend, Catherine, one evening. Raphael? It's Catherine. I need to talk to you about Suzanne. I feigned concern. Is everything all right, Catherine? What's going on? She came to me asking for a loan, Catherine said, her voice tight with discomfort. A pretty substantial one. I remembered your email and I just don't know what to do. I'm so sorry you've been put in this position, I said, allowing a hint of genuine sympathy to color my tone. You're a good friend for even considering it. But Catherine, I have to be honest, I don't think you'll ever see that money again if you lend it to her. Catherine sighed heavily. I was afraid you'd say that. God, what a mess. I never thought Suzanne would. I know, I said softly. Neither did I. But people change, I suppose. Or maybe we just never really knew her at all. After hanging up, I couldn't help but smile. Suzanne's support system was crumbling, just as I'd planned. Soon, she and Brian would have no one to turn to but each other, and even that relationship was showing signs of strain. Reports from Malcolm indicated that Brian had started drinking more heavily, his behavior becoming erratic and unpredictable. Suzanne, used to his confident swagger, was now faced with a man drowning in his own insecurities and rage. One evening, as I was going over some paperwork, my phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source, Jenny, an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. Raphael, I hope I'm not overstepping, but I heard about what happened with Suzanne. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here. I stared at the message for a long moment, a mix of emotions swirling in my chest. Jenny had always been kind, supportive, everything Suzanne had proved not to be. For a brief moment, I considered responding, reaching out for that human connection. But no, I couldn't afford distractions. Not now, when my plan was coming together so perfectly. I set the phone aside without replying, turning my attention back to the task at hand. As the weeks wore on, I watched from afar as Brian and Suzanne's lives continued to unravel. Brian, once the picture of arrogant success, now looked haggard and worn every time I caught a glimpse of him. Suzanne, struggling to maintain her polished exterior, was showing cracks in her carefully constructed facade. I was reviewing some legal documents in my study when the doorbell rang. Frowning, I checked the security camera feed on my phone. My eyebrows shot up when I saw who was standing on my porch. Suzanne. For a moment, I considered ignoring her. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see firsthand how far she'd fallen. I opened the door, and the sight that greeted me was almost shocking. Gone was the polished, confident woman who had walked out on me. In her place stood someone I barely recognized, hair unkempt, clothes wrinkled, dark circles under her eyes. "Raphael," she said, her voice trembling. I need to talk to you." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Talk about what, exactly?" She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I've made a terrible mistake. I see that now. I was confused, lost. I thought Brian was everything I wanted, but I was wrong. So wrong." I felt a surge of satisfaction at her words, but I kept my face impassive. "And what do you expect me to do about that, Suzanne?" She looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. I thought, maybe we could try again? I know I hurt you, but we had something good once. Maybe we could find our way back to that. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine it. Taking her back, rebuilding our life together. But then I remembered that night, Brian's sneering face, Suzanne's cold indifference as she tore my world apart. "No," I said, my voice hard. "We can't. Raphael, please," she begged, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll do anything. I've lost everything. My friends, my money. Brian's changed. He's not the man I thought he was. You're all I have left." I felt a cold smile spread across my face. "That's where you're wrong, Suzanne. You don't have me. Not anymore. You made your bed. Now lie in it." Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "How can you be so cruel? This isn't like you, Raphael." "You're right," I said. "The man you knew died the night you betrayed him. This is who I am now, Suzanne. And you have no one to blame but yourself." With that, I closed the door in her face, ignoring her sobs and pleas. As I walked back to my study, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Suzanne had finally realized the magnitude of her mistake, but it was far too late. Later that evening, I received a call from Malcolm. "Raphael, I've got some interesting information for you," he said without preamble. I sat up straighter in my chair. "What have you got?" "It seems Brian's having some trouble holding it together," Malcolm reported. "He was fired from his job today. Seems those sexual harassment rumors finally caught up with him. He's been drinking heavily, and there are reports of some pretty volatile behavior." I nodded, even though Malcolm couldn't see me. "Good. Anything else?" "Yeah, actually. He and Suzanne had a pretty nasty fight earlier. Neighbors called the cops, but they were gone by the time the police arrived. This was an unexpected development, but not an unwelcome one. Keep an eye on the situation, Malcolm. I want to know if things escalate further." After hanging up, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and settled into my armchair, mulling over this new information. Brian and Suzanne's relationship was fracturing under the pressure exactly as I'd hoped. The next day, I decided to pay a visit to Brian's apartment building. I had no intention of confronting him directly, but I wanted to see for myself how far he'd fallen. As I approached the building, I heard raised voices coming from one of the upper floors. I recognized Brian's angry tone immediately. "This is all your fault," he shouted. "If you hadn't been so goddamn greedy, we wouldn't be in this mess." Suzanne's voice, shrill with fear and anger, responded, "My fault? You're the one who lost his job. You're the one who can't stop drinking." There was a crash, followed by a scream. Without thinking, I rushed into the building and up the stairs. I may have wanted revenge, but I wasn't about to let things go too far. I reached Brian's floor just in time to see Suzanne fleeing from his apartment, her face streaked with tears. She nearly ran into me in her haste to escape. "Raphael," she gasped, clearly shocked to see me. What are you doing here? Before I could respond, Brian appeared in the doorway, his face contorted with rage. When he saw me, his eyes narrowed dangerously. Well, well, he slurred, clearly drunk. Look who it is. Come to gloat, have you? I stepped in front of Suzanne, facing Brian squarely. I think you need to calm down, Brian, before you do something you'll regret. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Regret? I've got nothing left to regret, thanks to you. You did this, didn't you? Somehow, you orchestrated all of this. I met his gaze coolly. You did this to yourself, Brian. You and Suzanne. I just sat back and watched. With a roar of rage, Brian lunged at me. But his movements were slow, clumsy with alcohol. I easily sidestepped him, watching as he stumbled and fell to the floor. Suzanne gasped behind me. Raphael, we should go. He's not himself. I turned to her, my voice hard. And where exactly do you think you're going to go, Suzanne? Back to our house? That's not your home anymore. Her face fell, the reality of her situation sinking in. I don't know. I just can't stay here. I looked at her for a long moment, then at Brian, who was struggling to get to his feet. I felt no pity for either of them, but I also knew that letting things escalate further could complicate my plans. There's a motel about a mile from here, I said finally. Go there. Use this. I pulled out my wallet and handed her some cash. This is the last help you'll ever get from me, understand? Suzanne nodded, tears in her eyes. Thank you, Raphael. I don't. I cut her off. This doesn't change anything between us. Now go, before I change my mind. As Suzanne hurried away, I turned back to Brian. He had managed to pull himself up, leaning against the wall for support. This isn't over, he growled. I smiled coldly. Oh, I think it is, Brian. In fact, I don't think it ever really began. You were out of your league from the start. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving Brian to stew in his own misery. As I exited the building, I saw police cars pulling up, likely responding to the neighbors' calls about the disturbance. I melted into the shadows, watching as Brian was led out in handcuffs, ranting and raving. It was a pitiful sight, but I felt no sympathy. This was justice, as far as I was concerned. As I drove home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Brian and Suzanne's world was crumbling around them, and I had barely had to lift a finger. They were destroying themselves far more effectively than I ever could. But this wasn't the end. Oh no, I had much more in store for them. This was just the beginning of their downfall, and I intended to see it through to the bitter end. The weeks following Brian's arrest were surprisingly quiet. I focused on my work, throwing myself into projects I'd neglected during the tumultuous period of planning my revenge. But even as I tried to move forward, I kept a watchful eye on the aftermath of my actions. Malcolm's reports kept me updated on Brian's situation. He'd been released from jail after a few days, but the damage was done. His reputation, already in tatters, was now beyond salvaging. I made sure of that by anonymously tipping off his potential employers about his recent arrest and ongoing issues. One evening, as I was finishing up some paperwork, my phone rang. It was Jerry. Raphael, my man. How about we grab a drink tonight? It's been too long. I hesitated for a moment. I'd been so focused on my revenge that I'd neglected my friendships. But maybe it was time to start rebuilding that part of my life. Sure, Jerry. O'Malley's in an hour? Perfect. See you there, buddy. An hour later, I found myself sitting across from Jerry in our favorite booth at O'Malley's. He studied me over his beer, a mixture of concern and admiration in his eyes. You look good, Raph. Better than I expected, given everything that's happened. I shrugged, taking a sip of my whiskey. I've had time to process things, put them in perspective. Jerry nodded slowly. And Suzanne? Brian? Have you heard anything? A cold smile played on my lips. Oh, I've heard plenty. Brian's life is in shambles. Can't hold a job, drinking himself into oblivion. And Suzanne? Last I heard, she was couch surfing, trying to scrape together enough money to survive. Jerry's eyes widened. Jesus, Raph. I knew things were bad, but I had no idea. You didn't have anything to do with that, did you? I met his gaze steadily. Would it matter if I did? He was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. I suppose not. They made their bed. Can't blame you for making sure they lie in it. We clinked glasses, a silent understanding passing between us. Jerry had been through his own bitter divorce. He, of all people, understood the desire for retribution. As we continued talking, catching up on each other's lives, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of normalcy. For the first time since Suzanne's betrayal, I wasn't consumed by thoughts of revenge. I was just a man having a drink with his friend. But that moment of peace was short-lived. As we were getting ready to leave, I spotted a familiar figure stumbling into the bar. Brian, looking even worse than the last time I'd seen him. Jerry followed my gaze and swore under his breath. Want to get out of here? I shook my head. No, I want to see this. We watched as Brian made his way to the bar, demanding a drink. The bartender, eyeing him warily, asked for payment up front. Brian fumbled with his wallet, only to find it empty. Come on, man, he slurred. Just one drink. I'm good for it. The bartender shook his head. Sorry, pal. No money, no booze. Those are the rules. Brian's face contorted with rage. Do you know who I am? I used to be somebody in this town. The bartender remained unmoved. Yeah, and I used to be young and handsome. Times change, buddy. Now either pay up or get out. Brian's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, I thought he might take a swing at the bartender. But then his shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. This is your fault, he muttered, turning to face the room. His bleary eyes locked onto mine, recognition dawning. You did this to me. I stood up slowly, Jerry tensing beside me. I didn't do anything to you, Brian. You destroyed yourself. He lurched towards our table, nearly tripping over his own feet. You ruined my life, my job, my reputation, everything. I stood my ground, looking him dead in the eye. No, Brian. You ruined your own life the moment you decided to sleep with my wife. The bar had gone quiet, all eyes on us. Brian looked around wildly, as if searching for someone to back him up. But he found no allies here. Where's Suzanne? He demanded. What have you done with her? I raised an eyebrow. I haven't done anything with her, Brian. Last I heard, she wanted nothing to do with you. Can't say I blame her. Something in Brian snapped. With a roar of rage, he lunged at me. But his movements were slow, uncoordinated. I easily sidestepped him, watching as he crashed into our table, sending glasses shattering to the floor. Jerry stepped in, putting himself between Brian and me. That's enough, man. Walk away before this gets worse for you. Brian struggled to his feet, glaring at us both. This isn't over, he spat. I'll make you pay for this, Raphael. Both of you. I smiled coldly. I'd like to see you try. The bartender had had enough. He came around from behind the bar, grabbing Brian by the arm. All right, buddy. Time for you to go. As Brian was escorted out, hurling curses and threats, I turned to Jerry. Sorry about that. Guess I ruined our night out. Jerry shook his head, a wry smile on his face. Are you kidding? That's the most excitement I've had in months. Come on, let's help clean up this mess and then head out. We stayed to help the bartender clean up the broken glass and upturned chairs. As we worked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Seeing Brian so utterly defeated, so far removed from the arrogant man who had taunted me that night, was deeply gratifying. Later, as Jerry and I walked out of the bar, he turned to me with a serious expression. You know, Raph, I've got to hand it to you. When all this started, I was worried about you. Thought you might do something stupid, get yourself in trouble. But you've handled this whole thing like a pro. I smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. Thanks, Jerry. I appreciate your support through all of this. He nodded, then hesitated for a moment. Just be careful, all right? Brian's a loose cannon. No telling what he might do next. Don't worry about me, I assured him. I can handle Brian. And Suzanne, for that matter. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how far I'd come. The pain of Suzanne's betrayal was still there, a dull ache in my chest. But it no longer consumed me. Instead, I felt stronger, more resilient. I had faced the worst and come out the other side, not just surviving, but thriving. The next morning, I woke to a text from Jenny, the old friend who had reached out to me weeks ago. Hey Raphael, just checking in. How are you holding up? This time, I didn't hesitate to respond. I'm doing well, Jenny. Thanks for asking. How about we grab coffee sometime and catch up? As I hit send, I realized that for the first time in months, I was looking forward to something. The months following Brian's arrest dragged on, filled with tedious legal proceedings as Suzanne and I battled it out in divorce court. I had hoped for a quick, clean break, but Suzanne had other ideas. She'd hired Clint Drew, a shark of a lawyer known for his aggressive tactics and win at all costs mentality. I sat across from my own lawyer, Theodore Foster, in his plush office. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood desk between us. Raphael, Theodore began, his voice grave. I won't sugarcoat this. Suzanne and her lawyer are coming after everything. They're pushing for a 50-50 split of all assets, despite her infidelity. I leaned back in my chair, my jaw clenched. That's not happening. She doesn't deserve a dime after what she did. Theodore nodded, a glint of determination in his eyes. I agree, which is why I have a proposal. It's not pretty, but it might be our best shot at keeping what's rightfully yours. I'm listening, I said, leaning forward. We use Suzanne's affair against her. Hard evidence of moral misconduct can sway a judge. Do you have any of her private messages? Photos, maybe? For a moment, I hesitated. Using such intimate material felt like crossing a line. But then I remembered that night Brian's sneering face, Suzanne's cold indifference as she tore my world apart. I have everything, I said, my voice cold. Malcolm's been very thorough in his surveillance. Theodore raised an eyebrow. Malcolm? The PI? Raphael, how long have you been planning this? I met his gaze steadily. Long enough. Will it be enough to bury her in court? A slow smile spread across Theodore's face. Oh, it'll be more than enough. Suzanne won't know what hit her. As I left Theodore's office, my phone buzzed. A text from Malcolm. Incoming call from Suzanne. Wants to talk things out. Advice? I smiled. Suzanne was getting desperate. Good. Let it through, I texted back. I'll handle it. Moments later, my phone rang. I answered, keeping my voice neutral. Suzanne. Raphael, she said, her voice trembling. I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us, about everything that happened. Have you now? I said, my tone icy. Yes, she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. I was so wrong, Raphael. I was lost, confused. But I see clearly now. What we had, it was special. Can't we try to work things out? I almost laughed at the transparency of her ploy. Work things out? Suzanne, you destroyed everything we had the moment you jumped into bed with Brian. I know, she said, her voice taking on a pleading note. But people make mistakes, don't they? We could start over, rebuild what we had. Please, Raphael, just meet with me. Let's talk face to face. As she spoke, I hit the record button on my phone. Every word of her desperate attempt at reconciliation was being captured, ready to be used against her in court. All right, Suzanne, I said, feigning hesitation. One meeting. That's all I'm promising. Oh, thank you, Raphael, she exclaimed, relief evident in her voice. You won't regret this, I promise. As I hung up, another text from Malcolm came through. Brian's been in contact with Suzanne. They're planning something? I smiled coldly. Of course they were. Did they really think they could outmaneuver me at this point? Keep monitoring, I texted back. I want to know every move they make. Over the next few days, Malcolm's reports painted a clear picture. Brian and Suzanne, thinking they were being clever, were plotting to manipulate me into a generous settlement. They planned to have Suzanne play the part of the repentant wife, luring me into a false sense of security before making their move. Little did they know, their every word, every plan, was being meticulously recorded and documented. By the time we stepped into the courtroom, I had a mountain of evidence that would bury them both. The day of the trial arrived, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me. This was at the culmination of months of planning and maneuvering. As I straightened my tie and prepared to enter the courtroom, Theodore appeared at my side. "Ready for this?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. I nodded, my expression resolute. "More than ready. Let's finish this." We walked into the courtroom, and I caught sight of Suzanne and her lawyer. She looked pale, nervous, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. That hope was about to be extinguished. As the proceedings began, Clint Drew launched into an impassioned plea for fairness and equitable division of assets. He painted Suzanne as a devoted wife who had made one mistake and was now seeking redemption. When it was our turn, Theodore stood, his demeanor calm and confident. "Your Honor," he began, "we have evidence that will show Mrs. Howard's true character and intentions." What followed was a systematic dismantling of Suzanne's case. Theodore presented the recordings of her attempts at reconciliation, juxtaposed with intercepted communications between her and Brian, revealing their true motives. I watched as the color drained from Suzanne's face, her eyes widening in horror as her carefully constructed narrative crumbled around her. Clint Drew scrambled to object, to salvage something from the wreckage, but it was too late. The final blow came when Theodore presented evidence of their planned deception, the scheme to manipulate me into a settlement and then run off with the money. The judge's face hardened as he reviewed the evidence. When he finally spoke, his voice was sharp with disapproval. "Mrs. Howard," he said, "your actions demonstrate a clear pattern of deception and moral misconduct. In light of this evidence, I am ruling in favor of Mr. Howard. The division of assets will heavily favor Mr. Howard, with Mrs. Howard receiving only the bare minimum required by law." As the judge's gavel fell, sealing the decision, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was done. I had won. I turned to look at Suzanne one last time as I left the courtroom. She sat there, shell-shocked, her dreams of a lucrative settlement shattered. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and in that instant, I saw the full realization of her mistakes wash over her. Without a word, I turned and walked out, leaving Suzanne to face the consequences of her actions alone. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of activity. As I finalized the last details of my divorce, I kept a watchful eye on Brian and Suzanne. Their world was crumbling, and I wanted to savor every moment of it. One morning, I received a call from Clark Knapp, my inside man at Brian's former workplace. "Raphael," Clark said, his voice low and urgent, "you won't believe what's happening. Brian's completely lost it." I leaned back in my chair, a cold smile playing on my lips. "Tell me everything." Clark's words painted a picture of a man in free fall. Brian, desperate for money, had been taking increasingly risky loans. Now, the banks were closing in, threatening to sue him for unpaid debts. "And that's not all," Clark continued. "Remember those rumors we spread about his unstable behavior? Well, they've reached his creditors. They're all scrambling to collect before he completely loses it." I nodded, satisfaction coursing through me. "Excellent work, Clark. Keep me posted on any new developments." As I hung up, I couldn't help but marvel at how perfectly my plan was unfolding. Brian's life was in shambles, and Suzanne, well, she was about to make a desperate move of her own. Later that day, Malcolm's report confirmed my suspicions. Suzanne, seeing Brian as a liability, had made a calculated decision to cut him loose. "She's contacted Brian's landlord," Malcolm informed me, "provided evidence that Brian's been squatting illegally in his apartment. He's being evicted as we speak." I whistled low. "Cold move, Suzanne. I almost admire it." "There's more," Malcolm continued. "Brian's not taking it well. He's been ranting about getting revenge, making wild threats. I think he might do something stupid." I leaned forward, suddenly alert. "What kind of threats?" "He's talking about breaking into your house, stealing whatever he can find. Says he wants to confront you, make you pay for ruining his life." A plan began to form in my mind. "Interesting. Malcolm, I need you to keep a close eye on Brian. Let me know the moment he starts to move on this plan of his." "You got it, boss. What are you thinking?" I smiled, though Malcolm couldn't see it. "I'm thinking it's time to set a trap. One that'll end this game once and for all." Over the next few days, I prepared. I had security cameras installed around my property, linked directly to the local police station. I reinforced my locks, installed a state-of-the-art alarm system, and then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 nights later, as a storm raged outside, my phone buzzed with an alert from Malcolm. They're on the move. Brian and Suzanne, heading your way. ETA 20 minutes. I sprang into action, dialing the police as I moved through the house, making sure everything was in place. 911. What's your emergency? This is Raphael Howard, I said calmly. I have reason to believe my house is about to be broken into. I've already provided evidence of the threat to Detective Johnson. He should be expecting my call. Understood, Mr. Howard. We'll dispatch units to your location immediately. Please stay on the line. I settled into my study, watching the security feeds on my computer. Through the rain-streaked cameras, I saw 2 figures approaching my house. Brian, stumbling slightly, probably drunk, and behind him, looking nervous and unsure, Suzanne. I watched as Brian fumbled with the lock on my back door. The moment he forced it open, alarms blared throughout the house. On the security feed, I saw Brian freeze, panic clear on his face. Suzanne turned to run, but it was too late. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. I stood, straightening my jacket, and made my way downstairs. By the time I reached the front door, the scene outside was chaos. Police cars lined the street, their lights painting the rain-soaked night in flashes of red and blue. Brian and Suzanne were being led out in handcuffs, both looking shell-shocked. I stepped out onto my porch, sheltered from the rain, and surveyed the scene. Brian's eyes locked onto mine, and his face contorted with rage. "You!" he screamed, straining against the officers holding him. "You did this. You ruined everything." I met his gaze calmly, a slight smirk on my face. "No, Brian. You did this to yourself. You and Suzanne." I just sat back and watched. As the officers pushed Brian into a waiting police car, I turned my attention to Suzanne. She stood there, soaked to the bone, her eyes wide with the realization of how far she'd fallen. "Raphael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Save it, Suzanne. It's over. You've lost everything." As Suzanne was led away, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. It was done. Brian and Suzanne were going to jail, their reputations and lives in tatters. My revenge was complete. I turned and walked back into my house, closing the door on the chaos outside. As the sound of sirens faded into the distance, I poured myself a drink and raised it in a silent toast. To new beginnings, I thought, and to the sweet taste of justice served cold. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. The drama of the break-in and subsequent arrests had faded from the local news, but the aftershocks continued to ripple through the lives of those involved. I sat in my new home office, a spacious room with large windows overlooking a well-manicured garden. The house was different, bigger, more modern, a physical representation of my fresh start. As I reviewed some business documents, my phone buzzed with a text from Jerry. "Hey Raph, Jenny's joining us for drinks tonight. You in?" I smiled, a warm feeling spreading through my chest. Jenny had been a constant support through the darkest days of my divorce and the aftermath. What had started as friendship had slowly blossomed into something more. "Wouldn't miss it," I texted back. Later that evening, I found myself at our favorite bar, seated across from Jerry and Jenny. The atmosphere was relaxed, a far cry from the tension-filled months we'd all endured. "So, Raphael," Jenny said, her eyes twinkling, "how's life in the new place?" I took a sip of my drink, considering. "It's good. Really good, actually. It feels like I can breathe again, you know?" Jerry nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I get it, man. After everything you've been through, you deserve some peace." "Speaking of which," Jenny said, her tone turning serious, "have you heard anything about them?" I knew who she meant without asking. Brian and Suzanne, the architects of my pain, now facing the consequences of their actions. "As a matter of fact, I said, setting down my glass. "Got some interesting news today." Jerry leaned in, curiosity piqued. Oh yeah? Do tell. I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. Well, Brian's in prison. Multiple charges: attempted burglary, assault, some financial crimes that came to light during the investigation. He's looking at a pretty long stint. Good, Jerry said firmly. Bastard deserves every second of it. I nodded in agreement before continuing. As for Suzanne, well, she avoided jail time, but her life's in shambles. She's living with her cousin, Catherine. Apparently, Catherine's not too thrilled about the arrangement. I can imagine, Jenny murmured. After everything Suzanne did, I'm surprised anyone would take her in. From what I hear, it's not exactly a warm welcome, I said. Catherine's treating her more like an unwanted houseguest than family. Suzanne's working some minimum wage job, trying to scrape by. There was a moment of silence as we all absorbed this information. I waited for the pang of sympathy, the twinge of regret that I thought might come with hearing about Suzanne's fate. But it never came. Instead, I felt nothing. No joy in her suffering, but no pity either. Just a cool detachment. You okay, Raph? Jerry asked, studying my face. I nodded, surprised to find that I meant it. Yeah, I am. It's strange. I thought hearing about their downfall would feel, I don't know, more satisfying? But honestly, I just feel indifferent. Jenny reached across the table, squeezing my hand. That's a good thing, Raphael. It means you've moved on. Their lives, their problems, they're not yours anymore. I squeezed her hand back, grateful for her understanding. You're right. It's been such a long road, you know? Jerry raised his glass. To long roads and new beginnings, he said, and to friends who stick with you through it all. We clinked glasses, the moment filled with warmth and camaraderie. As we continued talking and laughing, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This, I realized, was what moving on truly felt like. The next morning, I woke to an unexpected email. The sender's name made my heart skip a beat. Suzanne Howard. For a moment, I considered deleting it unread. But curiosity got the better of me. The email was long, rambling at times. Suzanne poured out her regrets, her realizations about the magnitude of her mistakes. She wrote about her new life, the struggles, the humiliations, the daily reminders of how far she'd fallen. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, she wrote. But I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. I destroyed something beautiful out of selfishness and greed, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. As I read her words, I waited for the anger to resurface, for the old pain to rear its head. But again, I felt only a distant sort of acknowledgement. Suzanne's words washed over me, but they didn't touch me. Not anymore. I closed the email without replying. There was nothing left to say between us. Suzanne's regrets were her own to bear, just as my new life was mine to live. Later that week, I found myself at a gathering with close friends. Jerry was there, of course, along with Jenny and a few others who had stood by me through the darkest times. We were celebrating not just my divorce being finalized, but the start of a new chapter for all of us. As we stood on the balcony, watching the sun set over the city, Jerry raised his glass. To Raphael, he said, his voice carrying over the gentle murmur of conversation. A man who faced betrayal and came out stronger. You showed us all what real strength looks like, buddy. The others echoed his toast, their faces warm with genuine affection. I felt a lump form in my throat, touched by their support. Thank you, I said, my voice rough with emotion. All of you. I couldn't have made it through without you. Jenny slipped her hand into mine, giving it a gentle squeeze. You did the hard part yourself, Raphael. We just cheered you on. As the party continued around us, Jenny and I found a quiet moment alone. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine. How are you really doing, Raphael? With everything? I thought about it for a moment, trying to put my feelings into words. I'm at peace, I said finally. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. She smiled, understanding in her eyes. I'm glad. You deserve happiness, Raphael. Real, lasting happiness. As I looked at her, I felt a warmth spread through my chest. This was what I had been fighting for all along, not just revenge, but the chance at a new life, a better life. The party wound down as the night grew late. As the last of our friends said their goodbyes, I found myself alone on the balcony with Jerry. "Hell of a journey, huh?" he said, leaning against the railing. I nodded, looking out over the city lights. "That it has been." "You know," Jerry continued, his voice thoughtful, "when this all started, I was worried about you. Thought you might lose yourself in the revenge." I turned to look at him, raising an eyebrow. "But you supported me anyway." He shrugged. "You're my friend. I figured you'd either work it out of your system, or I'd be there to pull you back if you went too far." He paused, then added with a grin, "Plus, those bastards had it coming." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. "That they did." As Jerry left, promising to catch up again soon, I stayed on the balcony for a while longer. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the pain, the carefully orchestrated revenge, and I realized that somewhere along the way, the anger that had driven me had burned itself out. In its place was something else, a quiet strength, a deep-seated confidence that whatever life threw at me, I could handle it. I had faced my worst nightmare and come out the other side not just surviving, but thriving. I thought about Suzanne, working her minimum wage job, living under the judgmental eye of her cousin. About Brian, sitting in a prison cell, his arrogance and bravado stripped away. I felt no joy in their suffering, but no pity either. They had made their choices, just as I had made mine. As for me, I had a whole new life ahead of me. A life free from the shadows of betrayal and resentment. A life with friends who had proven their loyalty, and perhaps even a new chance at love with Jenny. I smiled as I turned to go back inside. My revenge hadn't just been about destroying Suzanne and Brian. It had been about reclaiming myself, about rising from the ashes of betrayal stronger and wiser. And in that, I had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. As I closed the balcony door behind me, I felt a sense of finality. This chapter of my life was over. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. I had won, not just against Suzanne and Brian, but against the bitterness and pain that had threatened to consume me. I was free, and the future had never looked brighter. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.